It had been a long time since I heard from Emma, my younger sister. We'd always been close growing up. 2 peas in a pod, as Mom used to say, but over the last few years, we'd drifted apart. She had moved to another city for her career, and I was busy with my own life, juggling work and the never-ending responsibilities that came with being an adult. The last time I saw her was at Christmas, but it wasn't the best visit. We'd barely spoken. Emma was distant, quiet. There was something weighing on her, and I didn't press her to talk about it. It felt like we were both avoiding something, like the distance between us had grown so wide that we didn't even know how to bridge it anymore. So, when I received the email from her in the middle of March, I was surprised. The subject line simply read, "Family Reunion at Lakeview Resort." I stared at it for a while, confused. A family reunion? Wasn't it a little early for that? And honestly, we hadn't had a big gathering in years. The thought of a weekend getaway with the entire family sounded appealing, though. It could be the perfect opportunity to reconnect with everyone. We all had our own lives, and the annual holiday gatherings were no longer a thing. Mom had been pushing for something like this for a while now, but we all seemed to put it off for one reason or another. I clicked on the email, and Emma's familiar voice greeted me. The message was short and sweet, detailing a weekend at a lakeside resort a few hours away. She mentioned that she'd arranged everything, accommodation, meals, and activities, and that all I needed to do was show up. No fuss. She even included a link for payment, suggesting that everyone chip in a little to cover the costs. A simple, no-pressure family reunion. I hesitated for a second. The idea of paying for a whole weekend was a bit of a stretch for me, but I didn't want to seem like I was holding back. Besides, Emma had always been the one organizing family events. If she was taking the initiative, I wasn't going to be the one to spoil it. I remembered how she used to be, the life of the party, always planning things for everyone. Maybe this was her way of reconnecting with all of us, trying to bring us back together. The weekend was set for the first weekend of April, and with work being a little slow at the time, I figured it would be the perfect chance to get away for a few days. The resort was a quiet, picturesque place by the lake, nestled in the mountains. The pictures on the website made it look like a peaceful, rustic retreat. I imagined the sound of the water lapping against the shore and the smell of fresh pine. It was the kind of place I would have liked to visit on my own, but this time it would be with family. So I confirmed my attendance, transferred the money, and waited. As the days passed, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of anticipation. It had been so long since the entire family had gathered. I was excited to see everyone again, but at the same time I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Emma hadn't really given any details about the event, other than that it would be a family reunion, and for some reason the thought of being surrounded by relatives I hadn't seen in years was a little intimidating. The more I thought about it, the more I began to wonder why Emma hadn't reached out to me personally about this. After all, we used to talk about everything. Why the email? Why the lack of personal touch? The week before the reunion, I called her. My intention was simple. I wanted to make sure everything was in order. I hadn't heard from her since the email, and I wanted to check in. It rang a few times before she picked up. "Hey," Emma's voice sounded cheerful, but I could tell there was something off. "How's it going?" "Good. I was just calling about the reunion," I said, trying to sound casual. "I just wanted to make sure everything's set. The payment went through, right?" "Oh, yeah," she replied quickly, almost a little too quickly. "Everything's good. You don't have to worry about anything. Just show up and we'll take care of the rest. It's going to be fun." "Are you okay?" I asked, a little more seriously. "You sound a little off. Are you nervous or something?" There was a long pause. For a split second, I thought she was going to tell me something important, something I had missed, something that might explain the sudden invitation. But she didn't. Instead, she laughed softly, as if brushing it off. "No, nothing like that. Just a lot going on, you know. Anyway, can't wait to see you." She hung up before I could say anything more. I was left staring at my phone, feeling like something was slipping through the cracks, something that I couldn't put my finger on. The day before the reunion, I packed my bags and drove out to the resort. The drive was long, but the changing scenery, hills giving way to forests and eventually the lake, helped clear my mind. The anticipation had turned into something else now, curiosity. I was beginning to wonder what Emma had in mind for this family weekend. She wasn't the type to do anything too conventional, but then again, we hadn't had any family gatherings in years. Maybe she was just trying to shake things up a bit. I arrived at the resort in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The place was even more beautiful in person. An old stone lodge with wooden beams, large windows that overlooked the lake, and a wraparound porch that had been tastefully decorated with hanging lights. The place was rustic, but in a cozy, charming way. As I checked in, the front desk staff gave me a warm welcome, confirming that my room had been prepared and pointing me to the main lodge where the family would be gathering. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at the familiar atmosphere. It was nice to be in a place that felt like it was built for relaxation. When I stepped into the main lodge, I was greeted by my parents and a handful of relatives. Everyone seemed to be in high spirits, laughing and chatting like no time had passed at all. It was the kind of scene I remembered from family holidays when I was younger. I gave hugs to everyone, settling in for what I assumed would be a typical weekend catching up on life, telling old stories and maybe playing some games. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The decorations, fresh flowers in vases, candles arranged on every table, seemed a little too much for a simple family reunion. The dinner setup was elaborate, with long tables covered in white linens and silver cutlery that glinted in the soft light. And then there was the food, gourmet, restaurant-quality dishes that seemed far too extravagant for the occasion. It was like something you would expect at a wedding, not a casual gathering. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I made small talk with my cousins, aunts, and uncles, trying to focus on the conversations around me. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and that only made me more curious. What was she up to? Why was she acting so distant? And why had she organized everything this way? As the evening continued, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. Everything felt staged, like there was a grand reveal waiting to happen, but no one was saying anything. I tried to push my worries aside, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something I wasn't prepared for. Little did I know, I was about to learn the truth in the most unexpected way possible. The morning after I arrived at Lakeview Resort, I woke up to the quiet murmur of a perfect spring morning. The sun had barely risen, and I could hear birds chirping through the open window. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air, and I felt my muscles relax for the first time in months. It had been so long since I had taken a real break from the grind of work and life. Here, in the heart of nature, there was a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I stretched and glanced around the cozy, rustic room. Just show up and we'll take care of the rest. It's going to be fun. Are you okay? I asked, a little more seriously. You sound a little off. Are you nervous or something? There was a long pause. For a split second, I thought she was going to tell me something important, something I had missed, something that might explain the sudden invitation, but she didn't. Instead, she laughed softly, as if brushing it off. No, nothing like that. Just a lot going on, you know. Anyway, can't wait to see you. She hung up before I could say anything more. I was left staring at my phone, feeling like something was slipping through the cracks. Something that I couldn't put my finger on. The day before the reunion, I packed my bags and drove out to the resort. The drive was long, but the changing scenery, hills giving way to forests, and eventually the lake, helped clear my mind. The anticipation had turned into something else now, curiosity. I was beginning to wonder what Emma had in mind for this family weekend. She wasn't the type to do anything too conventional, but then again, we hadn't had any family gatherings in years. Maybe she was just trying to shake things up a bit. I arrived at the resort in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains. The place was even more beautiful in person. An old stone lodge with wooden beams, large windows that overlooked the lake, and a wraparound porch that had been tastefully decorated with hanging lights. The place was rustic, but in a cozy, charming way. As I checked in, the front desk staff gave me a warm welcome, confirming that my room had been prepared and pointing me to the main lodge where the family would be gathering. I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at the familiar atmosphere. It was nice to be in a place that felt like it was built for relaxation. When I stepped into the main lodge, I was greeted by my parents and a handful of relatives. Everyone seemed to be in high spirits, laughing and chatting like no time had passed at all. It was the kind of scene I remembered from family holidays when I was younger. I gave hugs to everyone, settling in for what I assumed would be a typical weekend, catching up on life, telling old stories, and maybe playing some games. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The decorations, fresh flowers and vases, candles arranged on every table, seemed a little too much for a simple family reunion. The dinner setup was elaborate, with long tables covered in white linens and silver cutlery that glinted in the soft light. And then there was the food, gourmet, restaurant-quality dishes that seemed far too extravagant for the occasion. It was like something you would expect at a wedding, not a casual gathering. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I made small talk with my cousins, aunts, and uncles, trying to focus on the conversations around me. Emma was nowhere to be seen, and that only made me more curious. What was she up to? Why was she acting so distant? And why had she organized everything this way? As the evening continued, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach. Everything felt staged, like there was a grand reveal waiting to happen, but no one was saying anything. I tried to push my worries aside, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. Little did I know I was about to learn the truth in the most unexpected way possible. The morning after I arrived at Lakeview Resort, I woke up to the quiet murmur of a perfect spring morning. The sun had barely risen, and I could hear birds chirping through the open window. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air, and I felt my muscles relax for the first time in months. It had been so long since I had taken a real break from the grind of work and life. Here, in the heart of nature, there was a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I stretched and glanced around the cozy, rustic room. The furniture was simple but comfortable. Wooden bed frame, a soft quilt, and an armchair by the window that beckoned me to sit and enjoy the view. I had chosen a single room, far from the main gathering area, giving me a bit of solitude. It felt like a retreat, a place to unwind and enjoy the calm before the inevitable social whirlwind of family came full force. I quickly got ready and made my way downstairs. The lodge had a warm, welcoming feel, with large windows letting in the early morning light. The entire place was designed in a way that made you feel like you were transported to a different time, away from the chaos of the outside world. The scent of fresh coffee reached me before I even stepped into the dining area, and my stomach gave a grateful rumble. I hadn't realized how much I had missed the little comforts of home. Family breakfasts, the slow morning rhythm. In the dining room, several of my relatives had already gathered around a large wooden table, chatting over steaming mugs of coffee and plates of scrambled eggs, bacon, and pancakes. My parents sat at one end of the table, laughing with my aunt and uncle, while my cousins, who had grown up so much since I'd last seen them, were catching up. The atmosphere was warm, familiar, and easy. For a moment, I forgot about the lingering feeling of unease from the night before. "Morning," I said as I made my way to the table, smiling at the familiar faces. "Hey, you're up early," my cousin Jamie said, motioning for me to sit next to him. He was a few years younger than me, but he had always been the life of the party, always making everyone laugh. His enthusiasm had never waned, and it was nice to see him so lively. I took a seat, feeling the warmth of the group. I hadn't realized how much I missed being part of a large, noisy family. We often get caught up in the routine of life, in the never-ending rush to succeed and manage our responsibilities. But here, in this old lodge by the lake, time seemed to slow down. "How was the drive?" my mom asked, looking over her coffee cup. She had always been the one who worried about everything, even the smallest details. "It was fine," I replied, glancing around the table. "I didn't expect the place to be so beautiful. The lake and the mountains are incredible." "Well, that's Emma's doing," my dad added with a smile. "She picked it out. You know how she is with planning these things. I can't believe she managed to keep everything under wraps for so long." I nodded, though the words felt a bit off. The whole weekend felt a bit like it was too perfect, too planned. I didn't know if anyone else had noticed the oddness of the situation or if it was just me overthinking things. There was something beneath the surface that I couldn't quite figure out. As the morning went on, more family members trickled in. The table grew fuller and the conversation became louder. Laughter bounced off the wooden walls and there was a tangible sense of togetherness. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something was a little off. I kept looking for Emma, wondering when she would make her grand entrance. She hadn't been around much since the previous night, and her absence was starting to feel more conspicuous. After breakfast, my Uncle John suggested a walk by the lake. It was a sunny, warm day, the kind that made you want to be outside. Everyone agreed, and we all gathered in the front yard, chatting as we strolled down the path that led to the water's edge. The air was fresh, and the landscape was breathtaking, the kind of place that made you appreciate how small the world really was, how vast and peaceful nature could be. As we walked along the shore, my cousins and I took turns skipping stones across the surface of the lake. The sound of the pebbles hitting the water was soothing, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. Everything felt like it should. Yet, in the back of my mind, Emma's absence nagged at me. I could tell my parents were looking for her, too. They were exchanging quiet glances, clearly trying to figure out where she had gone. It didn't make sense. Why would she not be here? She was the one who had planned this entire thing. The whole family was gathered in her honor, and yet she was nowhere to be found. We returned to the lodge around noon, and the rest of the afternoon passed with games and casual conversation. I didn't see Emma the entire time. It felt like there was a missing piece to the puzzle, but no one was acknowledging it. Even my parents seemed content to go along with the day's events, acting as if everything was just fine. Dinner that evening was, once again, a feast. The tables were set with fine china, cloth napkins, and candles flickering softly in the center. It was hard not to notice how extravagant everything was. The evening carried the air of a special event, and for some reason, I couldn't stop wondering if this was all part of a bigger plan. Just as I was lost in thought, the doors to the dining room opened and Emma finally walked in. She was wearing a simple yet elegant dress, one that I hadn't seen before. It was a soft shade of ivory, and she looked stunning in it. Her eyes were shining, and there was a nervous smile on her lips. For the first time all weekend, I saw a flicker of the old Emma, the confident, happy, and radiant sister I remembered. Everyone stopped talking the moment she entered. My eyes widened as I realized that something was happening, something important. She didn't make a grand announcement or call attention to herself immediately. Instead, she stood by the door for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for everyone to notice. And then, with a quiet breath, she spoke. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice calm but carrying. "I know this weekend has been a bit of a surprise for everyone, but there's something important I need to tell you all." My heart skipped a beat. There was an intensity in her voice that I hadn't expected. My parents looked at each other, their faces suddenly serious, as if they were bracing themselves for something. Everyone in the room grew silent. "I wanted this weekend to be special," Emma continued, "and I wanted it to be a moment just for our family. But I also wanted to keep it intimate and meaningful. So I decided to combine this family reunion with something else." She paused, glancing around the room, her gaze settling on each family member in turn. My heart raced. What was she about to say? Had she planned some sort of surprise event? Emma took another deep breath, and then the words finally came. "This is also my wedding day." The room went completely still. My parents' faces were a mixture of shock and confusion. Everyone else looked around at each other, unsure of how to react. And for me? For a long moment I couldn't process what she was saying. A wedding? Here? Now? Emma explained quickly, as if trying to reassure us. "I've been planning this for months, and I didn't want anything big or extravagant. I didn't want all the attention. Just you, just family. So, I've been keeping this a secret." It all clicked into place at once. The extravagant meals, the lavish setting, the meticulous arrangements. It wasn't just a family reunion. It was her wedding, disguised as something else. Emma had pulled off the greatest surprise of all. She had secretly arranged everything, and I had unwittingly paid for her wedding without even knowing it. The room was filled with gasps and murmurs as the reality set in. My mind was racing, trying to catch up. I felt a mix of emotions: surprise, confusion, and even a bit of betrayal. How could she not tell me? How could she not let me in on this secret, especially since I had helped fund everything? Emma looked at me, her face full of concern, as if she could read my thoughts. "I'm sorry you didn't know," she said softly. "But I wanted to do this the way I felt was right. I hope you understand." And in that moment, I realized that this was Emma's way of taking control of her own life, her own happiness. She had been distant for so long, and maybe this was her way of finally doing something for herself, without any expectations or outside influence. As much as I was shocked, a part of me couldn't help but feel a strange sense of admiration for her courage. This was her big day, her moment, and she had chosen to share it in the way that made the most sense to her. It was then that I knew the real meaning behind this weekend. It wasn't just about a family reunion. It was about creating a new beginning. The words hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. "This is also my wedding day," Emma had said. Her voice was calm but resolute, though the tremor in it betrayed her nerves. It took a few moments for the shock to sink in, and during those seconds the room seemed to fall into a strange, almost suffocating silence. I stared at her, trying to piece together what she had just said. A wedding? Here? Now? My mind was racing, scrambling for any hint of a clue I might have missed. How had I not realized? How had I, of all people, been kept in the dark? I'd been the one to pay for this entire weekend. Accommodation, food, everything. And now it turned out that I had unknowingly funded my own sister's secret wedding. My first instinct was to feel betrayed. Emma had always been close to me. We'd shared everything as kids. I was supposed to be the person she turned to for advice, for help. But instead, she'd planned all of this behind my back, making me the unwitting sponsor of her big day. The quiet, gnawing resentment started to creep up, but it quickly gave way to a deep, almost overwhelming confusion. I glanced around the room. My parents were sitting at the table, their faces frozen in shock, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. My mom's hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide as she stared at Emma. My dad had an unreadable expression, his brow furrowed as if he was still trying to process the information. The rest of the family, equally stunned, looked back and forth at one another, unsure of how to react. Some seemed taken aback, others genuinely delighted, while a few couldn't hide their surprise. "Wait, what?" My Aunt Carol was the first to break the silence. She looked at Emma, her voice laced with disbelief. "You've been planning this all along?" Emma nodded, taking a step forward, her hands clasped together in front of her, as if she were trying to steady herself. "I've been planning it for months. Tom and I didn't want a big wedding, just something small and intimate. I didn't want to deal with all the stress and expectations. I wanted it to be about family, about you all being here with us. That's all that matters to me." Tom, her fiancé, stood beside her. He was a tall, quiet man, reserved, almost shy, but I could see the warmth in his eyes as he gazed at Emma. His hand rested gently on her shoulder, a comforting touch. He looked as stunned as everyone else, but clearly proud of what Emma had orchestrated. I couldn't help but look at him and wonder when they had decided this. How long had they been planning it in secret? Emma and Tom had been together for almost 2 years, but they had never talked about getting married, at least not with me. In fact, I didn't even know that they were engaged until now. I had seen them occasionally, visiting her in the city or getting together during the holidays, but there had never been any indication that things were moving in this direction. I didn't want the big traditional wedding, Emma continued, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for validation. I wanted something that felt more like us. And I trusted you all to help me with this. I wanted you to be part of it, but I didn't want to make it a big spectacle. I didn't want to make it a big production. The words felt like they had an undertone to them. Was she apologizing for something? Or was she trying to justify her actions? I wasn't sure. What I did know was that everything about this moment, about this entire weekend, was being turned upside down. My emotions were a whirlwind. At first I felt a flash of anger. How could she keep something so important from me? Why didn't she just tell me, especially when I had paid for everything? Then came the realization. This wasn't about me. It never had been. Emma had planned this for herself, not for anyone else. She wanted to create a moment for herself and Tom, something that felt true to who they were. And yet, the more I thought about it, the more I understood why she had kept it a secret. Maybe this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about freedom. The freedom to make her own decisions without feeling burdened by the expectations of others. As the silence in the room stretched on, I stood up, my hands suddenly clammy. I needed to process this. I needed space. I excused myself, quietly slipping out of the dining room and into the cool evening air. The lake outside was even more breathtaking in the dusk, the water reflecting the last traces of sunlight. I walked to the edge of the dock, leaning against the wooden rail and letting the gentle ripples of the water calm my racing thoughts. Why hadn't Emma told me? Was I so wrapped up in my own life that I missed something important to her? I had always prided myself on being the supportive, understanding sister, the one who was always there when Emma needed me. And yet here I was, left in the dark, feeling more like an outsider than family. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and there she was. Emma. Her face was softer now, less anxious than when she'd first announced the news. She had changed into a simple white dress, elegant but understated. She looked beautiful, but it was more than that. There was a glow to her now, a confidence that hadn't been there when I arrived. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice gentle. I nodded, stepping aside so she could join me at the dock. We both stared out at the water for a while, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves from the trees nearby. I wasn't sure where to begin. What could I say? "I know you're angry," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry for not telling you. I didn't want to hurt you, I didn't know how to explain everything." I shook my head. "It's not that I'm angry, it's just—" I paused, looking at her. "Why didn't you tell me, Emma? I'm your sister. I could have helped. I could have—" "You did help." She cut me off, her voice steady now but still full of emotion. "You helped in a way you didn't even realize. The whole weekend, the venue, the food, everything. I wanted it to feel like a family gathering. It was never supposed to be a grand spectacle. But I knew if I asked for help, it would turn into something I didn't want. It would become about everyone else and not about what I needed. I didn't want to disappoint you or Mom or anyone else. But I also didn't want to go through all the pressure of a traditional wedding. I didn't want to feel like I was doing it for someone else." Her words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized that Emma had been carrying something heavy for a long time. The weight of expectations, of feeling like she had to live up to other people's standards. She had kept it inside for so long that I had missed it, too caught up in my own life to see what she was struggling with. I let out a long breath, trying to push past the frustration. "I get it," I said quietly. "I just wish you'd told me. I wish I hadn't felt left out of it." "I didn't want you to feel like you were part of the deception," she said, her voice thick with sincerity. "I wanted to surprise you, but I also didn't want to make you feel uncomfortable or like I was hiding something from you." I looked at her, searching her face for any hint of dishonesty, but all I saw was vulnerability and regret. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was just trying to protect herself. And in doing so, protect me from something she felt I might not understand. "I'm not mad," I said finally, taking a deep breath. I wish you had trusted me with it. I would have understood." "I know," she whispered, her eyes filled with regret. "I just didn't want to make you feel like you had to do anything. I didn't want you to feel like you were obligated to be a part of it in any way." For a moment we both stood there, the weight of the conversation settling between us like an unspoken understanding. And for the first time since I arrived at the resort, I felt like we were truly seeing each other again. The divide that had existed between us for so long seemed to disappear, replaced by something much more profound. Emma had made her choice, and while I hadn't been a part of it, I realized that she had done what felt right for her. "I'm happy for you, Em," I said, my voice softening. "I really am. I need some time to get used to all this." She smiled, a small, relieved smile. "I understand. And I'm sorry. I really am." We stood there for a while longer, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. In that moment, I realized something. No matter how different our lives had become, no matter the secrets and the surprises, Emma was still my sister, and that, in the end, was all that really mattered. As the night crept in and the stars began to emerge, I knew that this weekend would forever be etched in my memory, not just as a surprise wedding, but as a reminder of how family can surprise you, challenge you, and ultimately bring you closer in the most unexpected ways. The days following Emma's revelation passed in a blur of emotions, a strange blend of shock, understanding, and quiet tension. The night she revealed her secret to everyone was, for the most part, a whirlwind. The rest of the family, despite their initial surprise, slowly came to terms with the idea of Emma's wedding. There were questions, lots of them, about why she had kept it a secret, about Tom, and about what would come next. But despite all the inquiries, Emma and Tom remained calm, their quiet, loving presence grounding everyone in the midst of the chaos. The following morning, as we all gathered again for breakfast, the mood was different. The excitement of Emma's wedding, though still buzzing in the air, felt a little more subdued. Some people looked at each other with a bit of disbelief, as if the events of the previous evening had been a dream. Others were simply grateful to have been included in such a personal moment, even if it hadn't unfolded in the way they had expected. I found myself sitting back a bit, watching it all unfold with a sense of detached wonder. Emma had always been the center of attention in our family, intelligent, driven, and always with a sense of purpose that made everyone look up to her. But in the wake of her wedding revelation, I was beginning to see a side of her that I hadn't known existed. A side that was vulnerable, uncertain, and deeply human. She wasn't perfect, but she didn't need to be. She was simply living her life on her own terms, and somehow that made her even more admirable. I noticed my parents were still trying to process the enormity of it all. They'd spent the better part of the morning sitting quietly at the table, speaking in low voices, exchanging glances. It was clear that they were still adjusting to the idea that Emma had chosen to take this monumental step in such an unconventional way. But as the day went on, they seemed to soften, accepting that Emma's decision, while unexpected, was hers to make. That afternoon I found myself alone with Emma. We had retreated to the porch of the lodge, where the cool breeze from the lake carried the scent of fresh pine. Emma sat with her legs curled beneath her gaze fixed on the horizon as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I had to admit, she looked happier than I'd seen her in a long time, almost peaceful. There was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself now, a contentment that had been absent from her demeanor in recent months. "I think Mom and Dad are still in shock," I said, sitting beside her, trying to break the silence. "They're taking it better than I thought they would, though." Emma smiled faintly, her eyes not leaving the view. "They'll get there," she said softly. "It's just so much to take in. I know it wasn't what they expected, but I hope eventually they'll understand." "I think they will," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. The dynamics in our family were always shifting, and my parents had always had a strong hold on the way things were done. This was new for them, and change, even a happy one, was never easy to accept. Emma glanced at me then, her eyes locking onto mine for the first time that afternoon. "I know you're still upset with me," she said quietly, "and I understand why. I should have told you sooner. I should have trusted you more." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of me still felt hurt, but another part of me, one that had always stood by Emma, supported her in her decisions no matter how unusual, understood what she was trying to say. "I wasn't angry, Emma," I said finally. "I was just confused, surprised. I thought I knew everything about you, about us, and then this happened." I paused, collecting my thoughts. "But I get it now. I do. This was your choice, your moment. I was just blindsided." Emma looked down at her hands, fiddling with the edge of her dress, her fingers tracing the fabric. "It wasn't about you, really. It was never about what anyone else expected. I just wanted something that felt like it was mine. I needed to be sure, before I could share it with anyone, even you." There was something in her voice, a note of quiet regret, that made me soften even more. I had never realized how much Emma had been carrying on her own. For all the confidence she exuded, there had been an invisible weight that had weighed heavily on her heart, the pressure of making everyone happy, of meeting everyone's expectations, of living up to some ideal. She had been trying to please us all, but in doing so, she had silenced her own needs. "I understand," I said again, my voice gentler now. "I really do." For a long time, we just sat there in silence, watching the colors of the sky shift as the sun sank lower. The warm light bathed the landscape in a soft glow, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect, like we were all exactly where we were meant to be. Later that evening, as the preparations for Emma's wedding were in full swing, I couldn't help but notice the change in the atmosphere. There was an almost magical quality to it all, like we were part of something bigger than ourselves, something beautiful and intimate. Emma had kept everything small, just a few close family members and Tom's immediate family. The ceremony was to take place right at the edge of the lake, where the water shimmered under the moonlight, and the air was filled with the scent of wildflowers. The lodge had been transformed. A small wooden altar was set up by the water, decorated with ivy and twinkling fairy lights. White chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the sound of soft music drifted on the breeze. I hadn't realized just how much effort had gone into creating this moment until now, and as I watched the final touches being put into place, I couldn't help but feel a surge of admiration for Emma. She had created something beautiful, something personal, and something entirely her own. I glanced at my parents, who were speaking quietly with some of the other relatives, their earlier shock now replaced with quiet acceptance. They were smiling more, speaking with warmth to the people around them. It was clear that, in the end, they were happy for Emma, even if they hadn't fully understood the decision at first. And I knew, deep down, that this would be something they would come to cherish. The moment the ceremony began, everything seemed to fall into place. Emma walked down the makeshift aisle, her arm linked with our father's, her face alight with joy. She looked stunning, of course, radiant and calm, as if she had finally found a peace that had eluded her for so long. And Tom, standing at the altar, his eyes shining with love and pride, was the perfect match for her. The ceremony itself was simple, yet profoundly moving. There were no extravagant vows or lengthy speeches, just two people who had found something real, something lasting, in each other. The officiant spoke gently, asking Emma and Tom to exchange their vows, and when they did, it was as if the entire world fell away, leaving only the two of them, bound by love and a quiet promise to each other. As Emma spoke her vows, I could hear the tremor in her voice, the emotion that bubbled up as she promised to love Tom for the rest of her life. It wasn't just about the words she spoke, it was about the feeling behind them. The years of struggle, of figuring out who she was and what she wanted, of finally understanding that she deserved happiness. I could see it in her eyes, the certainty that at last she had made the right choice. Tom spoke his vows with equal sincerity, his words simple but full of meaning. There was no pretension, no grandiosity, just a quiet promise to stand by her side through everything. And in that moment, I realized that this was all Emma had ever wanted, to be with someone who truly understood her, who would stand by her without judgment, who would let her be herself. As they exchanged rings, the crowd erupted into applause, and I couldn't help but feel a lump in my throat. The whole weekend, despite the confusion and surprises, had come together in such a way that it felt like a testament to Emma's journey, her growth, and her search for true love. And in that moment, I realized that I was proud of her. Not just because she was my sister, but because she had taken control of her own life in a way that most people would never have the courage to do. The reception that followed was a blur of laughter, dancing, and heartfelt speeches. Everyone was relaxed, finally enjoying the weekend for what it was, a celebration of love, family, and new beginnings. I watched Emma and Tom dance together, their smiles bright and full of love, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over me. This was where she belonged, with him, and everything else had fallen into place. Later that night, when the guests had started to leave and the lights had dimmed, Emma and I sat on the porch together again. The air was cool and the sky was dotted with stars. "I'm glad you're here," Emma said softly, leaning back in her chair, her face reflecting the happiness of the day. "I'm glad too," I replied, my voice full of sincerity. "It's been a lot to take in, but I'm happy for you, Em." She smiled, a quiet, content smile, and for the first time in a long time, I saw her at peace. "Thanks for understanding," she said. "I couldn't have done this without you." We sat in silence for a while, watching the night sky, knowing that the future was full of unknowns. But one thing was certain. Emma had made her choice, and it was the right one. And in that moment, I realized that no matter what happened from here on out, I would always support her. This was her journey, and I was lucky to be a part of it. The weekend had ended. The surprises had been unveiled, the misunderstandings cleared up, and what had once seemed like a family reunion gone awry had transformed into something truly unforgettable. A wedding, a new beginning, and a sister who, despite everything, had found her happiness.